right, so we are going to go ahead and get started because our time with the mayor is precious. So we're going to go until 10:15. The mayor has squeezed us in, he's got a busy day. So we appreciate his time here. Just a couple minutes for context. So this is actually a class. This is a class, Social Justice Advocacy, that Beth, Gillia, and I co-teach. And in the class, we go through different change strategies. So what often will come to mind first for JD students is going to be impact litigation. But we also talked about other skills and strategies that we don't want you all to forget when you go out in the world and become the next leaders of our state. So things like community organizing, community economic development, media strategies. So a lot of different types of change strategy. And so we've had different guest speakers come and talk as subject matter experts on those, and the mayor has graciously agreed to come and talk sort of the culmination of it all. So how do you put all of these pieces together to make effective change for your communities? And so that's just a little bit of the context. So we're sticking with sort of the class format. We've had our guests introduce themselves, kind of tell us their story about how they got to where they are and what drew them to their work. And so we're going to stick with that format today. So,
cool. Thanks. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. And I love this informal style, so I have random notes, but I'm just going to set them right there, and I'll refer to them as needed. I'll try and be very judicious with our time. So if I'm staring up at the clock, it's not because I want to leave. Because this is way more fun than everything else I'm doing today. So a little bit, let me do a little bit of background. Then I'll tell you about a few things that we're working on that I think tie in kind of to the mission a little bit. And then I want to save a decent chunk of time for questions. And first, let me just say it's great to be at our law school. So I do not have a law degree as an aside, so we'll have to translate your legalese and so forth. But obviously I work in an arena that is filled with all things legal and so forth. And let me just say to everyone who's here and to the faculty and stuff, UNM Law School really produces pretty much every leader, almost every leader in our state and our city, which is awesome. That is a really cool thing. And it has been, for a long time. So this is not like a new trend. And so I know, I was trying to think in my head on my cabinet, like how many went to either UNM or UNM Law School. It's gotta be like 75%, so very cool. It'll give a little commercial for our legal department at the end, which is run by a UNM Law grad. Esteban Aguilar, in case you didn't know who the city attorney was. So, okay, a little bit of background. I was born and raised here, just in case folks don't know a little bit about kind of my story. Grew up behind Del Norte High School, and I actually left for about 10 years. So I went away to school, and then had an interesting 3-year stint in Cambodia, where I started a social enterprise it was the first IT company in the entire country. And actually back then, amazingly, Cambodia had line-of-sight wireless internet. This is in the year 2000, like we still don't have here. But Cambodia had it no problem. And but it was helping landmine victims and actually trafficked women get alternatives to employment for the trafficked women. And then for the landmine victims, they obviously, if you think about it, tend to not have work. They can't walk and stuff. So the computer is very good for those two segments of folks. So it was in Cambodia when I actually decided that I really wanted to move back home. And so for me, for those of you who've been born and raised here, or whether you just moved here, this place has a tendency to sort of get its hooks in you for whatever reason. And this is sort of course, the land of entrapment angle too. And it was amazing. I never appreciated New Mexico and Albuquerque until I left. That was kind of the weird thing about growing up here. I think like in high school, actually the high school party scene was really fun, but other than that, I was like ready to leave. I was like, I gotta get out of this place and see the world and this kind of thing. And it was amazing how like 6 years later, I was like, I want to move back home. So I think like some of us, I moved back home with my parents. That's like another part of the land of entrapment. So moved back in with my parents, and I kind of restarted my life around, it was about age 27, and I was actually trying to pay off grad school debt. So I had this huge corporate job in Houston, and I was flying back and forth from Albuquerque to Houston on Monday and then coming back on Thursday. And so this was kind of my first 3 years where I sort of moved back, but I wasn't still working here. And then, eventually I want to get to kind of the substance of the course and not just tell you my life story. But I got involved. I ended up buying a little town. I moved out of my parents' house, right? This was the first thing I'm working on. So I got a little townhouse in what later I renamed with the community, the International District. Of course, some people remember its old name. In that community, we don't like the old name. Just as an aside, I know people tend to use the war zone a lot, but I will tell you, in that community, as my, I used to be the state senator for that district. That community feels that term is in many ways derogatory, both ethnically and also because there's lots of high crime everywhere. So this is another, which we'll get to. So, but long story short is, so I moved in, got a nice infill piece of housing, and I got involved in my neighborhood association, and also, it's obviously I hate to say I'm a politician, but I guess it's true at this point. So, so I got involved in my case, the Democrat Party. So I was in the precinct chair, and then I was ward chair. But mostly I was working with this international district for healthy communities and things. So anyway, long story short is I ended up running for the Senate, the state Senate, in a contested primary, which is something actually, especially back then, you almost never saw. It worked out, so I happened to win, which was great. And I was represented that community for 2 election cycles, and had a whole lot of fun in the roundhouse. So I'm happy to answer questions about the state legislature. Just since this is law school, in case you might know a little bit about how that works, I was, in the end, the majority whip, so I got involved in a lot of inner workings on how the deals are cut and how the system works, and amazing stories from that era. But anyway, then I ended up running for a state auditor. And so I have a MBA and a finance background. And I learned about the state auditor when I was a state senator. And I was like, wow, this is this cool job that, has a lot of potential and can do a whole lot of things. And so that was a really amazing experience. And of course, involved some work out here at UNM too, and different audits all around the state. Very interesting. But in the meantime, there was Albuquerque. There was our city. And living here now, by this time I'm married, have kids. I have a 3 and a 5-year-old now. What my wife and I were seeing, and she was born and raised here too, and it is a city that, look, over 10 years, we just somehow lost our way. And the reality is, depending on how long you've been here, what era you remember, there was a time when our city was up there with Denver and Phoenix and Salt Lake and Austin. And when I say up there, you can define that any way you want. In other words, it could be per capita income, it could be economic growth, it could just be coolness, or it could be reputation. And then all of a sudden, and it was a very slow train, I think. We woke up one day and it's we are the worst in almost every crime statistic, right? We have the lowest per capita income. And all of a sudden, we're peers with Lubbock, not to pick on Lubbock. A compliment to Lubbock, hopefully, I don't know. So, this is sort of where we're at as a city. And so, anyway, again, because I'm just going to cut the bio short, but see my website for more. But, we really felt that I was going to change what I believe now, is sort of where I can add the most value is to jump in the race for mayor. And of course that was a 9-person race, and then there was a runoff election, and I was publicly financed, which was very cool. But anyway, I'll try and just wrap that up, because I could easily do an hour on why I ran for mayor. But the short story is, I actually believe that our city is in a very tenuous situation. And if we don't get a few things right, we are really going to be stuck for a generation, if not more, in terms of this slow downward path. And so I came in saying, 1, we have to acknowledge where we're at. We have to say, things have not been going well on a number of fronts. And then number 2, we've got to address them head on. And I'm going to speak to this in a little bit with some examples, but I think what we were doing is we were trying to kind of use the rose-colored glasses. We were saying let's try these new fancy ideas that are like a press release or a pilot project or something that's happening in another city. But they weren't actually meaningful systematic change, which is kind of, I think, in many ways what this seminar is about. And so we're actually running, I hope, an administration that is very substance-based. And I'll give you some examples on that, but we believe less in like the sizzle and more in the steak. And I think that was kind of some of the challenge before. I don't think we really realized how messed up our town was. And a lot of our ideas to deal with it were not serious ideas. So let me mention a few of those. Let's start out with crime. Now, again, I would love to talk about how crime has turned the corner, and for the first time in a decade, these numbers are actually going down. That's all true, and that's great. But I want to kind of reflect, I think, on this concept of, how do you deal with these big challenges that are across multiple disciplines. So, for example, I ran, I believe, on a grand bargain that I made with the city of Albuquerque, whether people really thought of it in this way or not. But the bargain looks like this. Number one, we're going to acknowledge how bad our use of force and issues have been and why the DOJ, right, is taking over our police department. Historically, we were like resisting that. It became this, and when I say we, you can read into who that is, and however you want to interpolate that, but I think it's definitely a broad we, but there's certainly certain people who are in charge of it. But it was kind of this attitude like the DOJ is this annoying thing that we're trying to do because someone told us to do it. That is a complete disrespect to why the DOJ is here, right? They are here because people have unjustly been shot, okay? So that, let's just be clear, that's why they're here. This is something that previous administrations would not talk about. We talk about it. And we also completely transformed our police department to deal with this. So now we have a compliance bureau, which I would love all of you to work in and help us with, because I will tell you, it is extremely taxing on our police department, but it's the right thing to do. It also takes a ton of paralegals and legals to actually work on this. And so this didn't exist before. Again, it was like a side project or a pilot project to deal with the DOJ. We're saying, no, we have to do culture change. That is going to take decades. Usually DOJ consent decrees take anywhere from 10 to 40 to 60 years. So again, in Albuquerque, we had this attitude that's like, well, they'll come in, we'll fix it, and they'll leave. That's not how it works. And as you know probably better than I do, no judge is fooled by that. And they tried, right? They tried with Judge Bragg. And he let them know that this was serious. So that's one side of the bargain. Here's the other part, though. Our streets are unsafe, right? We do have extremely high crime. And because of the way, in some ways, that the DOJ was handled, we also lost trust in our police department, but our police department lost trust in us, and they lost trust in the administration. And in many ways, they felt like the community didn't support them anymore. And I think in some ways, actually, that was true. And some of this also has to do with, they're the multi-layers, which I think is part of what this is all about, right? This also has to do with collective bargaining with our police union, how they hadn't had a deal in a long time. And also their compensation, which again is obviously it's money, but it's also a reflection of value. And it's also the fact that everyone was leaving our department and that no one would support our officers with backup. And what I mean by this is literally the number of officers. So going back to high school, just for fun, roughly when I was in high school, we had about 1,190 officers. And this is about 20 years ago, I think. I've lost track. But so when I came into office, we had 839. 839! So these officers are going out into the street in an acknowledged dangerous environment with some of the highest crime in the country, right? And one, they don't even have enough backup. They don't have a narcotics team. They don't have gang unit behind them. They don't have all the resources they need. And then on top of it, we have all these use of force problems, right? So I believe, at the highest level, the grand bargain is we've got to help public safety. We have to help law enforcement be able to actually make our town safer. And on the other hand, we got to respect why the DOJ is here. We got to change the way we do things at APD. These two things are the challenges basically I think show up on my desk in one way or another almost every day. So you see this play out in all sorts of ways. We gave our officers the first 2-year collective bargaining agreement in 10 years. We gave them a 12% raise and another 8% raise this year. We now acknowledge personally that we are responsible for DOJ reforms, and we are not going to shy away from that, and we're going to change our use of force policy. We avoided dealing with use of force policy because it was the hardest thing, right? Use of force policy, your lawyers, what is that? That is like when an officer has the right to use force on a civilian, right? That tough question was avoided for years, and now we said we're not doing anything else until we figure that out. Now I forget that, I think there's like 8 parts to it and we finished 7. There's some sort of, we're not like totally done, but we are mostly done. That is a huge deal, right? And you can see, so I will tell you from a leadership perspective, right? I had to put these 2 things together, right? You can't do those 2 things separately, just if you're not reading between the lines here, right? You can't really redefine what it means to be an officer in our police department and also not stand up for them when it comes to collective bargaining. So those 2 things so far have worked. And also, we're gonna get 100 more officers because of those 2 things. People have, officers I think now believe in the leadership at APD. I think also, for the most part, there's always challenges. Our community actually trusts our police chief and our leadership. And by the way, if you, Mike Geyer is one of the few, like, there's like people who are good people and who do good things, and then there's like these, I hate to use the term hero because that could be defined as like a lot of things, but like if you learn about this guy is a total anomaly because he is the embodiment of that grand bargain, right? So Mike Geyer has a respected history in the community, in the international district, with folks from all walks of life. And even in Chicago, this is his 2nd career. He also did this in Chicago. But also, he has the respect of the frontline officer. That never happens. He is a unicorn. So this is like, the grand bargain playing out in different areas, including my selection of a police chief. And so that's the amazing thing is, it's not lost on me that he's a white guy and he looks like my older brother or my dad. You see him, but that's obviously not why he was picked. He is truly an extraordinary individual in background, and so I just hope he can be police chief for as long as we can. Now that said, we also have learned that we make mistakes. So in this grand bargain, right, we've also learned that on both sides, we've learned that our internal affairs department, which their job is to investigate, when these things go wrong, has had a lot of challenges. We know that the culture change there goes all the way down to the front line, all the way to how reports like show up on someone's desk and how long they've been there, and whether or not the cover sheet's been changed and things like this. This is how, in some ways, sick our department has been. But on the other hand, I know that we have said that we are going to honor the public input side of this. And we talked to APD Forward and the other amici entities in the DOJ reform. We actually move faster now with them than the courts need us to. So in other words, we're doing this on our own together as a community now, whether or not like the judge is being changed out. So I just got the latest draft of they're called the IMRs, the reports from the monitor, right? All of these we could have delayed. It would have been easy just to say, let's take 3 months off, we're changing judges. We're not. We are moving forward in step with the community. So I'll happy to answer more questions on kind of that concept, but that to me is the biggest thing that I've been able to, I think, hopefully continue to try and fulfill every day. And that, I think, was that grand bargain was missing, right? Those 2 pieces had to come together, and they still have to work together, right? We can't go on one side and fix one thing without addressing the other. And so we continue to do that. So let me mention one, I think, other area that's in a completely different vein, and it's about more in economic development in terms of business. And this one is another situation where I think we had the same story that was happening in Albuquerque. So we had this concept where we wanted to be, seemingly by the ideas we were pushing out, we wanted to be someone else. We wanted to be Silicon Valley, or Austin, or Denver, or you name the idea that we're sort of cherry picking. Now, I'm a believer in best practices, so like I get that. Like you got to steal any good idea you can. I'm happy to. But there's also something about identity of who we are. And I have sort of different lighthearted examples, but it's like we named our, the Innovate Albuquerque's building is the rainforest, right? This is a book. This was a book that I remember the city leadership, however you want to define that, both private and public sector, everyone read this book called The Rainforest. And I remember going to like NAOP meetings, and people be like, have you read the rainforest? I read the rainforest, we gotta do the rainforest. And it was like about Silicon Valley. And then we try and do it, and then we name the building the rainforest, right? That building is named after the book that like is the concept behind it. But also it's like, it's New Mexico, like we don't have rainforests. Can we call it something that's remotely relevant? So, that said, like, I love that concept. Like, in other words, what we did at Innovate ABQ I actually think is a good idea. So I'm not in any way commenting on the idea. I'm commenting on how we've lost our identity as a city, right? And this happens when you leave, right? Everyone says, well, what do you know? You're like, I'm from Albuquerque. Oh, Breaking Bad, right? Balloon Fiesta. And it's like, we are more than a fiesta or a TV show. But I'm gonna get to Breaking Bad in a minute, right? But I want us to be known, and I hope we can be known for what makes us unique, which is, of course, our cultural heritage. It's that we're at a crossroads, and we have been since time immemorial. It's that, oddly, that highway through to Harris and the Rio Grande, right? That's why we're all here. That's why even originally, the Puebloan communities anchored here along the Rio Grande. So, and that continued whether it was, Camino Real or it was Route 66 or it's the Big I, like this is our story. But what's different about our story is the major cultures that have passed through this crossroads are still here. And so, I think we all know this, but we are the only place I can think of in America, other than maybe Honolulu, where our native languages are still spoken, where culture is intact and residencies, communities are still in the same place more or less where they have been. And of course our Hispanic heritage, which is in many ways all around us and stronger here, I'd say as a city and as a state than any other city or state. I know there are certain neighborhoods in big cities where it might be different. But that's what makes us unique, that's our story. That's what we should reflect. Now, this, believe it or not, brings me to Netflix. So let's go back to Breaking Bad and that identity. Why is the film industry here? Well, we know we have a bunch of incentives, right? This is sort of, to your point about the grand bargain, about whatever you said, the medium class. Lots of things coming together. We have state laws that have film incentives. We have the Albuquerque Film Office. But let's go back a little bit further. Why were they originally out here? The irony, right? It was based on a stereotype on our culture, right? It was this like cowboys and Indians thing, right? That's why Hollywood started filming out here. But this does go way back to the beginning of television. And so that story, even though it's kind of for the wrong reasons, right? It might have been for exploitative reasons, but like it's actually part of that crossroads story. These are connected. The film industry actually is a reflection in many ways of our identity. Whether we, for good and bad. That identity that, sometimes also hurts, and it includes scars. So now, it's like Netflix, Breaking Bad, we have the film industry, we have all these incentives. People are like, well, Breaking Bad, this is the ultimate kind of, I think, fulcrum for like where our city's at. They talked about crime, right? The reality is, sadly, a lot of what was in that show, which is a great TV show if you're into TV shows, but of course a lot of that is true, right? That's what we started with when we came in. But we would not have Netflix if we didn't have Breaking Bad, right? And we wouldn't have Breaking Bad if we didn't have the film industry, and we wouldn't have the film industry if we didn't have that actual core identity. So these things are connected, and so what I'm trying to do from an economic development perspective is say, look, we have to build on our strengths. I do not want to be Austin anymore. I'm not trying to be Silicon Valley. I want us to be the best Albuquerque we can be on our own terms, in ways that reflect or in some ways build on our core identity, and what makes this city unique. That also means placing bets in winning areas. So like in the film world, we compete and we win. And people are like, well, why don't you bring, whatever, like, electric car manufacturing here? Well, look, I'll take it, right? I'm not saying no to anything. But it's like, okay, are we good at making cars here? So it's like, some of this, like, you have to start from your strengths, and I believe on building on that. That's how I believe we build our economy. The other strength is, of course, there's a whole technology angle. There is, with the labs and the tech transfer, and even with UNM. And so there's a whole sliver on that with lasers, which is directed energy. This is a big part that I'm a believer in. We're going to be working on details on how we're going to do this. So the other thing is those small business, right? So unlike a lot of other cities, we are very local. And we have lots more small businesses per capita than most other cities our size, at least in the West. So what we're trying to do is use our economic office in ways that actually supports an increment of one. So this is how do we get a small business to hire one more person? And we're actually rolling this out in 30 minutes. So we're creating a fund, the increment of one fund, to actually do this. We have, because Kellogg is related to this, we have an outstanding Kellogg grant also to do this. And the idea is that we have to solve that problem for a small business. Sometimes it means providing collective accounting and legal background so that they don't have to use all their money to contract it all out. So we can have like a shared lawyer between 4 small businesses, something like that, especially around intellectual property. So details on that if anyone's interested, but we're trying to do that. And then we're also trying to say, okay, instead of trying to recruit any random company like Amazon, this is like the elephant hunting thing. It's like, Amazon, like, come back, you know, Tesla. And so we're trying to say, we want to focus on companies that we actually have a competitive advantage in. So in many ways, the best bet right now, at least, is around, drug interspersal injections. This is like how you take medication, like you like shoot it into your skin, you know what I'm talking about? These are like the injectables. We're really good at this. That was terrible. The other one is lasers, which is directed energy. We're one of the best in sort of optics and photonics, and so we're going to try and say, you know what, we do want the world's best photonics companies to come move here, and we're going to try and recruit them. So those are the 2 prongs. Like one is about bigger business, attracting out-of-state business. The other one is about building from within, being the best that we are. And the last part of that, and I'll wrap up, is around buying local. So we, again, talk about this a lot, and there's like press releases about buying local. We decided we were going to do this in reality. So like, I actually looked, and it turns out the city spends hundreds of millions of dollars in out-of-state companies. And it's like, well, why do we do that? My business cards, right here, printed in Phoenix. So this is still the first box I got. The next box won't be. Just and the coffee we drink was from Phoenix, like in the mayor's office. This is how bad this problem is. And the funny thing is, to the point about like layers of legalese and different things, like all of this has to do with the procurement code, believe it or not, and also cost. So what happens is basically you solve for ease of getting through the procurement code and the cheapest product, and you will always end up out of state, basically. That's how our laws are set up right now. And I tried to change some of these in the legislature and as auditor. But as mayor, like in all of these areas, I'm actually trying to methodically do it myself. So literally, we just changed the coffee company. And now we do pay more for our coffee, but it's from here. And I'm okay with that. Same thing for business cards. Those are going to cost like 2% more than the ones from Phoenix. I'm okay with that. So we are going systematically through literally it's 2,000 plus contracts and trying to understand which ones we can swap out with local businesses. Believe it or not, that's also contract law. So like everything is about, okay, what's the penalty for breaking it? And can we break it next year, or do we have to let it run out? Or is this like a group purchasing thing? And then we have to work with that increment of one small business side to say, okay, coffee company, Humble Coffee, like how can we actually how can you get your coffee into City Hall? Because believe it or not, they're usually not set up to even fill out the paperwork to be able to do that. So this is how complicated things like buy local get. And so with that, let me kind of just do a short stop because it's 10 o'clock already. And I'm happy to talk about questions on any of this.
So I'm going to just remind everyone this is a class, and so we wanted to give priority to the students who are in the class to ask questions first. So any of the students in the class who have a question that they'd like to.
So, hi, I'm Angelica, by the way. So thank you for your time and coming and explaining all that stuff. It's amazing what you're doing. I'm super happy to see that you've been being more inclusive of women in your administration. And one of the questions that I had was that intentional? Did you see a need for that? I mean, how did you come to that realization or to hire more women, especially in your leadership roles?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you knowing about, so our We should talk quickly about the structure of the mayor. So in Albuquerque, we have a strong mayor system. That's not a good or a bad thing, it's just what people call it. And it just means that there's separate branches, right? So there's an executive branch and a legislative branch. Oddly, not all cities are like that. Like Dallas is much bigger than us, they have a weak mayor system. So their mayor sits on council, sometimes even a non-voting member on council. I'm telling you this because there's one extremely important position in strong mayor cities, and it's the city manager. So that is the #1 executive, other than the mayor. But for like contractual purposes and signing purposes, like all signatory authority and all of these things, they all go through one woman. And her name is Sarita Nair. She's a UNM Law grad. So she should come back to your next class. And so for me, you know, I did want to demonstrate, and this predates a little bit of sort of the zeitgeist of where we're at now. But I've tried to have, for all, I hope, the right reasons, both for the concept of just getting different perspectives fundamentally, but also trying to on purpose break ceilings. So I have four former city managers that I easily could have hired. And the amazing thing about them, they're all men, they all took jobs and now report to Sarita, because they also acknowledge this too. I wanted to make a point that we had plenty of qualified women, including this particular individual, Sarita, who could do it. And so much so that I asked all these other folks who wanted that same job and who'd had it before, right? So like by definition, they're sort of more qualified. I asked if they would support Sarita and work for her. And the amazing thing is they all said yes. And one of them is another, I think, UNM Law grad, David Campbell. So that was kind of part of my thinking there. And for me, I've just always tried to have a balance. Obviously, I'm a white guy. I'm the only white guy in our executive team. And so I think that is important because we should reflect our city. Also, I think you have to be directive and forceful about it. These things don't happen automatically. Now, I will tell you this, so without going too far in kind of equity and inclusion, this gets really difficult, and it's the same challenge that you're talking about. So we've been trying to hire more, especially underrepresented communities, like the African American community, the Asian American community, and our refugee community. The amazing thing about this is there are all these bizarre roadblocks, like the computer. So in other words, if you put in now for a job that requires 10 years of experience in a certain field, if we don't catch the criteria for that job and relax it, make it so it's not super stringent, it's automatically set up so that it's only the next person below in the org chart who can get it. That's how a lot of governments work, and that's like the default setting. But if there's no people of color, women, in below that setting, right, you will never get anyone in that job. So we're trying to go through these postings and change it because like literally the computer cuts you out. So I can only hire people who make it through the NeoGov screen. And so if I get no one of color or no women on the way out, like I legally can't hire them. So I have to go back and I have to either fix that program, which is the whole like IT issue that's actually really hard, or before we put anything in that IT program, we're making all the job descriptions much more generic. We're making them applicable to, you don't necessarily have to have a degree or a specific degree. And that actually has the impact of getting a lot more women and folks of color in through that first gate. So I just wanted to use that as an example. But it's also the same thing with contracting. So we're trying to do a lot of minority and women-owned business contracting. Well, the city never tracked who owns what business and like their ethnicity or their gender. So again, when we're looking at bids, unless I actually know them, right, it can be really hard to tell. And then there's a little bit of a constitutional issue that sometimes cuts both ways, where people are like, look, this is a private business, I'm a private citizen, I don't have to disclose that to you. So now we have to give them an incentive to disclose that. And it's interesting that people, for all sorts of personal reasons, may or may not want to do that. So especially too, because we're trying to hire even immigrant-owned businesses, but like a lot of folks don't want to disclose that, right? So I'm just letting you know how complicated it is, but hopefully also saying that I appreciate that. And I think understanding that level of complication is why we need more help. If you want to help us with this as a fellowship, by the way, our Equity and Office of Inclusion is now like 6 people. We didn't even have that a year ago. Our Civil Rights Office didn't exist a year ago. Now it's 1.5, also headed by a UNM lawyer. So anyway, these are all areas too to think about going forward that I could use help in. Good question. And I'll let you screen whoever's not a student and tell me. Tell them.
And the student is not in the class.
Okay. in the class.
Right. So it seems like you have to expend, you talk about culture changes and APD and at kind of very base levels in the city. And it seems like you have to expend a tremendous amount of political capital changing that culture. How do you make sure that once all that political capital is gone, it doesn't just go back to what it was before? How do you break that cycle of like good 10 years, bad 10 years, good 10 years, bad 10 years? Like, how do you make it sustainable?
That's a really good question. One, in terms of expending political capital, it's also like my hair is turning gray really fast. I don't know. Anyway, my wife was like, "What happened to you?" And I was like, "It's this job." But like, it does take a lot of personal effort. So I think I just appreciate you even acknowledging that. But to your point about how you institutionalize it is so important. So one thing is filling people at every level. So I try and pay attention to like the front line and middle management and executive management, because I have learned that those trusted government bureaucrats, once you're in the classified system, you can't be fired. So except for a cause. I mean, lawyers can sort of do this, and you understand what I'm talking about. So the amazing thing is the 10-year plan, if I can get a critical mass of the right people who believe in, I guess, what I believe are the right set of culture and values that we should have going forward, they will last past 10 years. They'll outlive me by far. And so that's one way to do it, is to get folks in those classified jobs that you really believe in and that represent everything that I've talked about today. Now, that can be really hard to do because the mayor actually can't do that. Like, I am not allowed to specifically hire someone in a classified position. So you have to do it through criteria and all of these things actually that we talked about with your question. Now, so that's one way. And then you see this is why the reverse of culture change outlasts mayors, is because I think what they're trying to do is just change the top or just write a policy and they think that's it. So anyway, that's kind of one piece. The other one, especially in APD, is training. So the training all has to be approved by the state, and in our case has to be approved by the DOJ. We're spending a whole lot of effort on transforming our academy. And that, right, is where everyone comes in, even lateral hires. So if I can do what we need to do as a city there, then they will go out in the right way. But changing policies in that world takes, like, in other words, it's probably take me 3 years just to set up like the playing field for everyone who's coming in. But the good news is it's the same thing to undo it. So if the next person wants to change it all, they're gonna be like, oh no, like I've got all these people I can't fire. And I have all these policies that have to be run by the DOJ and by the state. And and I've got a legal department that's not really on board with me. And so you try and make things stick that way. I think that's really important. And then of course there's ordinances. So we haven't talked a lot about city council. But I wanna put as much as we can in ordinance. The challenge now is that I'm way out in front in terms of what we're doing than city council is from an ordinance perspective. But that's only to move fast. So it's kind of like this. If I look at 1 year, 2 terms, depending on what people want and so forth. I mean, I am definitely running again as an aside. I don't know if people will have me, but the way I look at it is like, you gotta spend your first 3 or 4 years like getting everything done that you can, because that's like your one shot. I mean, it's like, you gotta do that. But then you have to start thinking about your question. And so I actually am looking forward to like year 4 and if longer on how do we lay all this stuff out in ordinance, and so forth. But if you do the reverse, you wake up one day in year 3 and you haven't done anything. And so that's really what I've tried to avoid. And that's why when we came in, we outlined what are the things we want to stop, what are the things we want to start, what are the things we want to scale. And then the other side of that axis was what are the things we can do by ourselves, unilaterally. That's hiring, and that's executive policies, and that's contracts. And then what do we need counsel for, and what do we need partners for? And so that's kind of how we map out those different things. The most sticky, of course, being with council or even with state and so forth. Yeah.
So you had talked about like community organizing and working with like community members for the DOJ requirements. How do you have like community organizing strategies, or did you just wait for like those communities to come to you to help with this?
So in the DOJ context, these communities were already self-organized. And in fact, they really kind of brought the DOJ in. And so you actually have to kind of work with some of them because it predates kind of when I was there. But these folks had been working on this for like a decade. They thought there were issues. And finally, especially with James Boyd, then there was sort of that confluence of public will. The advocacy groups were already ready and there and willing. And at the time, the former mayor agreed to it. Like, that doesn't happen without the former mayor agreeing to it. I don't think he thought it would play out the way that it has, but that was, everyone actually did come together and say, we're going to do this. And so that's why it's a consent decree, right? Because all parties consented to it. But I would just say from my background, so when I got started, and if anyone is kind of from the international district, I got started really, frankly, I was like involved in Obama's campaign. That was the first time I was politically active in my life. I was not historically a politician. My family has no, in fact, my dad doesn't even like politicians. It's sort of interesting. I got started politically on the Obama campaign, which is, of course, very about community organizing, et cetera. It's also where I met my wife. She was on the Obama campaign, too. And then for me, what predated even that was what the international district was going through at the time. It had been, in many ways, and it still has, all sorts of challenges. But their representation was no longer listening to them or working with them. And so I originally was organizing around the name change. That name change was a 10-year effort. And then there were a couple of other people who wanted to run for elected office. And it was amazing because actually I was at Cafe de Lot, which is up there in that neighborhood. And I was there, like, literally I had no job. I was living with my parents. And I was like, I'm just here to help and learn, and I'll help you run for office, or like I'll door knock for you or something. And the people who were all trying to do this change, they all ended up having things happen in their lives. Like, one of them had some challenges with family and addiction and things like this. Another one had some health issues. And so it was the day before Thanksgiving. We were at an organizing meeting to take back our community, where I was there in a supporting role. And they were like, you're not doing anything, and you're really into this stuff. Why don't you run, and we'll support you? And I was like, I've always wanted to. I was like, that'd be awesome. Like, I would love to. But I was also like, I thought you were running, so it was kind of fun. And they were like, you know what, you do it. And that's how I got started. So it was actually really special for me. And those are still folks who've been with me in every campaign that I've had. And I'm just grateful for teaching me how to community organize.
So I think we should wind up now because the mayor needs to be somewhere in 15 minutes.
I do. We're going to roll out our increment of 1 in this part of the budget today, so that's what we're talking about.
But thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all.